Hi, I'm Stephanie Bakken. I work with Dana Crawford, and we have been working on this theater for about 5 years, I would say. Um, it's a great project, proud to be working on it, learn more about it all the time, and I'm very excited to hear what these experts have to say about this theater.
Wonderful. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name's Michael Powers. I've been in the theater business since 1961 as a rigger, designer, educator, etc. First got interested in historical preservation back in 1951 when my dad took me past the Tabor, and we went inside when nobody else was there and looked around. And I've been interested in historical preservation of things ever since, and especially in terms of the theaters, because I'm a theater guy, that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hello.
Hello, Gregory Friesen. I'm an architect working on this project. It's a thrill to work on a building that has such an illustrious history as this one does. And today is a high point, at least for me, to have these experts here. I cannot wait to hear what they have to say.
Hi, I'm Taylor Mueller. I work with Gregory with CSNA Architects. Excited for this tour and to see what these lovely folks have to say about the wonderful stage and rigging machinery.
Thank you.
Hi, Wendy Wasik Barrett, President of Historic Stage Services. My passion is the preservation of historical scenery and keeping that tradition alive and preserving historic theaters for future generations.
Thank you.
Lovely. I'm Laura Marsters here from Boise to support my spouse, who's a restoration specialist, and I was a theater geek in high school and college, and just really excited to see the theater.
Thank you.
Hi, Greg Marsters. I'm an architectural conservator. I own a company called Custom Plaster, and we specialize.
You had
One
background
of our
music
Trinidad
going
celebrities.
You know, it's like
He's passing by.
I can't dance.
Can't dance.
You're about to find that out, all of you at once. I'm Greg Marsters. I'm an architectural conservator. I specialize in restoration of decorated spaces and long interested in all preservation activity in Colorado.
Wonderful.
Excited to be here today. Stephanie, I know my heart. That's the idea.
Really?
Yeah, from CPI and from Saving Places Conference.
Gregory, would you describe the newspaper article and the photo of the original facade?
This one?
Yes, please.
Well, this is a excerpt from the local newspaper, and it's telling the story about the theater being open. We're fortunate to have a couple of historic photos that will enable us to restore the street front facade. This article is particularly interesting because from this one, this is where I believe we learned that the local Rap and Rap brothers toured the Iroquois Theater shortly after its fire, and were able to observe some of the corpses in situ before they were removed. And they came back to Trinidad, and this theater is, we can't say the first, it's perhaps the first theater to be completed after the Iroquois that incorporated a number of technical and life safety innovations, including the smoke exhaust cupola. When you look outside, there are standpipes that go all the way to the top of the fly loft. The egress path is fairly wide. It's just a significant building in the history of American theater post-Iroquois.
Would you describe the retail bays on the original photograph and these doorways that we're looking at? Just so we know where we're at here.
Sure. So one original interesting characteristic of the Rap and Rap theaters, and in the history of American theater, everyone associates the Rap and Rap brothers with the Chicago Rap and Raps. This was completed by the Trinidad Rappin' Raps. And there is historic documentation from the Rapp family archive that tells that one of the Chicago Raps made a trip to Japan. On his return, he stopped here and spent time with his two brothers. Now, if anyone has spent any time with architects and they're not an architect, you can just imagine how boring that conversation was if you're not an architect. But imagine architect brothers having a discussion about what they're doing, and for one of the Chicago Rapp brothers to see and hear about the preliminary stages of planning this theater. He went on, returned to Chicago. The Trinidad Raps finished this building several years before the Chicago Raps completed their first theater. So we can say with a high degree of confidence that this is the first Rappin' Rap theater in the United States.
That is so cool. That is so amazing.
But one of the innovations, and when you read about the Chicago Raps, even for their very large, medium-rise, big, full-block theaters in Chicago, is they always included retail spaces. And so what you see here on either side of the entry through which we've just come is a retail space here and a retail space here, which helped create a continuous income stream, because theaters are in weekends, they're in the evenings. What do you do to generate income the rest of the time? So this also was an innovation. And when you look at the Chicago Rap theaters, this is in every one of their buildings. So this is a pioneering from an architectural point of view, from a technical point of view, from a life safety point of view, from an economic feasibility point of view. This is a pioneering facility.
Would you draw our attention to what we found up here in the archway?
Yeah, I've been staring at that.
I will.
paying attention, Greg.
So this was pointed out to us by Jeff when he stopped here, and he did something like this. The stenciling, you can see a W, which is for the West. This was originally the West Theater. And there's a companion over there. And we'll see evidence of stenciling when we go inside. So that's quite the find. And one of the things we hope to do is a paint analysis. Let's strip it away, find out what the color of that was, see if we can learn if there is a mural, perhaps, behind this paint. Because when we look at the Rappin' Rap Theater in Raton, New Mexico, which is less significant than this one, it's smaller. The photographic evidence shown that it was beautifully painted with murals. So we suspect that where we can do so, and when we go in, you'll see that some of the paint is just irretrievable. We suspect, and we can show evidence of stenciling, that this was not slathered in this gray pink paint, but perhaps there are some wonderful murals here to be discovered.
How about what's behind that archway?
Behind this arch is what remains of the original plaster vaulted ceiling. And from the historic photos, we know that there was glass above here.
And there still is.
In 1935, when the marquee was installed, and this became part of the Fox Theater group, this drop ceiling in the vestibule was installed. And when we look what's above this drop ceiling, we can see that the plaster that made the arch itself was very carefully removed.
So the marquee was 1935.
35.
Okay.
And one of the issues we're dealing with is Colorado Historical Foundation has an easement, an exterior easement, because they provided funding to help purchase this building. So they kind of have right of first refusal, so to speak, where they are guardians of the building envelope. The easement says, allows modifications to be made based on historic photographs and other evidence. We're fortunate to have original construction documents for this building. And actually this article here has excerpts. These are excerpts from the original construction documents. I think the last one was dated 1907. So we have this evidence to allow us to restore the street front facade to this condition. But there are some, there is a group within the overseeing agencies, let's state it that way, who have a fondness for the marquee and are hoping that it can remain. We've had some investigations that show evidence that there's been a fire within the cavity of the marquee. It's all built from pieces. To investigate the full extent of the impact of that fire, we'd have to completely take it apart.
Right.
Because the wood framing has burned, we'd have to rebuild it. So then everything has to come off, and then it would have to be rebuilt and brought back. And so the core of that.
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
So the look with the actual marquee shows a very different look than the intent of the architect or how the silhouette would be or the profile against a skyline. So although this is very indicative of a certain time, it's not indicative to the originality of what would have been delivered by the architect and those making the original aesthetic decisions. That being said, it ties into part of an American history because they have the 1930 articles about the Fox West Theater being a division of Fox Theater and Fox Film. And there's the distinct separation of we're not really a monopoly, but I mean, so that it ties into something cultural, but I don't see that tying into the actual historic theater.
Well, that's what we think. We're trying to have our period of significance be from 1908 to 1929, just right up to the last days before it became part of this Fox family of theaters.
Which is the heyday before it was a very different focus on performance venues and cinemas. So it's a stark departure, both look-wise. I mean, you can see just with the name change how the aesthetic shifts over time. But that's not necessarily going back to the roots and what was created. So picking that period that you're going to try to celebrate, that will link it in with other regional theaters throughout the state, local, regional, and national. It would be lovely if the marquee weren't there. I was gonna say, sorry, you probably shouldn't take that. But because it's a very different.
You should say that. This from the eminent stage historian Wendy Wasserberg.
But it is, the first thing you see, it's like going into a theater, that opening is the focal point for the architect as you walk in. That is the introduction to the experience. This is an introduction to a different experience that was not the original experience. So if you go back to the original experience of what you walk through, the same thing goes when you walk into an auditorium. The experience wasn't this, the experience was still this because you were facing front. So it becomes the proscenium framing that sets the tone for what's on stage, and that unifies the entire auditorium. Which is why I like Greg, because it's the whole thing of it's a unified, concerted effort. You can't do the auditorium without the proscenium and the painted aesthetic that was delivered, or you change the feel and the experience, and you're not preserving the past. You're reinterpreting the past with the elements that you like.
Excellent.
If you were to actually remove that Fox marquee, as you well know, that marquee is in evidence in many theaters around the country. Detroit, Bama, you know, a number of them. But the question is, if that were to be removed for restoring the original theater, would there be some thought, I hope, to have it saved, reconstructed, put on display in some location, maybe close to this theater?
Our proposal is to mount it on the addition, because as you see coming in here, you immediately have this ramp all the way to the gallery corridor that's at the back of the theater auditorium, which originally, those archways were open.
Yeah.
So you could,
So cool.
So you could come in with this anticipation of arriving for a fabulous performance, and as soon as you come in, you get a glimpse of the stage.
And that's a really good thing to point out, because you go through a threshold and you experience each additional layer, building anticipation as you come through. And so that being open, and there were probably other doors or like an additional layer of curtains, it just adds to the anticipation as you go in and are able to recapture the experience.
So we want to do all of that. And so yes, we're proposing that we could, I pointed out this ramp because it does not comply with current ADA. We want to have an ADA compliant ramp in the addition to the west. And so since that's a secondary entry, we want to take the marquee and mount it on that part of the building. So
That's a
we've
great
removed it from the context, but it's still close enough that it will continue to contribute to the story of the history of the Fox West Theater
Yeah.
while we're restoring the West Theater.
Right, and you still give that experience of being able to enter with that. It's like you're doing double duty and being able to do the original and how it transitioned. That's a brilliant idea.
Great compromise.
Will that set in just a little bit? Will that set in just a little bit? The Andrew was talking about?
Yes, it will.
I figured you was.
In reading all the articles that are posted about the history of this theater, I was very interested in the first 10 years to discover that it's not named the Fox West because it's in the West. Because the original owner was named West. And that has stuck with it all this time, as well as Fox, since that group became involved.
Can I take a picture of those two articles?
Please.
Sure.
We've got digital copies of them all too,
We've got these
so I can get
digital
them.
too.
Well, that would be even better.
Yeah, we can
But I'm
send
still
this
going to
to
take
you.
it so I can
Please
actually
do.
read it tonight,
Oh,
because
absolutely.
this is, so as I was doing stuff, because your research is impeccable and wonderful, it was fun as I started to go through Colorado historical newspapers and newspaper archive, and this is great.
Were those two posters part of the photos that were in the history of the theater that I read online?
Yes, these are posted on somewhere on foxwesttheater.com.
I thought I'd seen them before. When I was reading that to Wendy yesterday,
This is.
she was driving, and so I didn't show her pictures.
All good.
For some reason.
Gregory, the poster that is hanging behind that piece of plank, that needs to be seen. That has a picture, and the only known picture, of the auditorium upon opening, and it represents the backdrop that is not hanging, but in fact some other backdrop.
Yeah, okay, I'm getting back there. I was gonna say, yeah, I don't know how we need to move this, but I'd like, I know you have a digital copy, but
I don't have a digital copy of that one, so what I'm gonna
Here you go.
I'll hold doors and you take photos.
Why don't you take it right down,
do,
Gregory?
I'm gonna
Thank
take
you.
it down. I'm gonna take it down from here and move.
Hey, while you're looking around, check this out.
I know you guys
Follow the
Sorry,
camera.
I didn't mean to like dissolve the group. Oh gosh.
See that door up there? If you look up, it's that little door at the top.
Yeah.
If you looked in there, this is what you would see. There's the original window.
So it's all, everything's there.
And then on the other side, facing the street, is the original archway with that plaster in these pictures here. Right?
Yeah, that'll go back easy.
Oh, won't it?
I know a guy.
I couldn't resist it.
I love the number of safes you have in this town.
Isn't it
I've only
great?
made it halfway up the way here, and I've already there's what, 3 of them out on the street.
Yeah. Many of them from the same company.
And now it wants to rest on the light. And I don't think
So this says Kansas City Scenic Company provided that one.
Yep.
the light is.
So Kansas City Scenic Company worked throughout the region.
Yep.
They had been founded by 1887 between Shute and Oldham and Dunn. And as they started sending out, Fred Megan, who is the representative, one of the salesmen by 1902, he would go on site with a little model and 100 scenes. In 1908, he was traveling with 100 different designs so that he could custom construct his little model, show all of the options, and then you would custom design a set. You would call it back to the studio as soon as the contract was signed and money exchanged hands, sometimes even before. You'd then be able to start processing the scenery. But this also links you with several theaters in the area where it had also been delivered to. And I've documented probably about 55 Kansas City Scenic Theater installations that go from 1887 to about 1912 so far. And they were delivering between 1908 and 1909 in Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Colorado, obviously, and I think there are a few more states. But you can see what was delivered, and they weren't just cookie cutter installations. There were standard designs, and new designs would be added. But it really is quite wonderful because it connects all of the Colorado theaters during that particular time period with almost in a spider web where there are links throughout. And at the same time this scenery was delivered, they were also winning as a baseball team in Kansas City because they were the Kansas City Company baseball team, and they competed against different baseball teams by theaters and paint manufacturers and everything. So that's what I found kind of really cool. But this is very standard as far as how it works, what a drop curtain would have looked like. It's quite beautiful. And do you have the original drop curtain, or has that just disappeared?
You'll see what's on the stage now.
Yeah.
Read this sentence from this paragraph.
They were given permission to inspect the frightful Iroquois Theater catastrophe before the human debris was even removed. They saw, they studied, and they learned much. And I think after all of the theater fires, it was because there were so many children.
That's exactly
And they were children
right.
of wealthy citizens
That's
of Chicago from the
exactly
400 Club. If it had been a bunch of poor children, I don't know if the care and the parents who had the affluence to go against legislators to make change really took that stance. But it's horrific, and the eyewitness accounts and the court cases, and I mean, there were fire suppression techniques since the 1860s. And it's not that it wasn't known of, it's often the people building the theaters didn't want to spend the money on the extra safety precautions. However, so this thing, this little smoke chimney, that's often why most scenery is damaged from water damage, because it would leak and condensation would get in. So
And
this,
the temper paints would be ruined.
right. So the only collection that I've ever come across that absolutely has none whatsoever, it's when the smoke chimney was shifted to the stage left side. Because the leaking came down on the stage left side, it still did a chimney, but it wasn't right over artworks that would be damaged by humidity and water damage. So when you get like little leaks, and this sometimes would also let in birds.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Chris, do we have a light here?
No, there's only a passageway on the other side.
Okay, I completely missed it. I was thinking.
Your intuition was correct, but the Schuler Theater in Raton, the next town down, has the same set of stairs over there, hiding behind that box. But also there's stairs here at the stage edge.
Maybe an orchestra pit under here? But you can't stand up, so we're not really sure if it's ever used as an orchestra. Well, it's really short.
The original auditorium floor, remember, was at least 6 or 8 inches lower. So the orchestra pit was reconstructed when they redid the floor. But Gregory can also speak to the orchestra pit's design not being as well represented on the architectural plans. That is, the plans represent something other than what was built.
This is really lovely. Yeah. So one of the things you want to look for is if it starts to dust and the paint needs to be consolidated, because so the way these things were painted is they had pure color, created it into a paste, and then basically mixed it with a diluted hide glue, which is why it will still reactivate with any kind of moisture. It just reverts to the painting. But over time, surface contaminants will put like this gray sheen over it, and you can easily remove it without damaging the painting. I even have Absorbent sponges with me right now, where we could go like, see how much cleaner this is?
Right.
But so with the surface contaminants, and even like pigeon feathers, the darks don't read as dark, and the lights don't read as light, so the scenic illusion has been flattened. And what was intended to be incredibly dimensional, I mean, it still is, but so much has been lost because of that surface contamination. And then to check to make sure that like it's not dusting, because pigments like artistic paint today still carries various toxic properties. And some of them are inert, some of them are not, and it would be only through testing. But if they don't move, it's like lead paint in a house, where you put a coat down to make sure that nothing becomes airborne. You don't want any of this to become airborne, and in some cases, the surface contaminants that are just dirt may actually be more dangerous than any of the colors that could go
But
on.
you can sort of encapsulate it.
You don't encapsulate, you basically clean, and then there is a layer of sealant that goes on top, which is the natural binder, the diluted hide glue, and that consolidates the paint so that it doesn't propose any like dusting off of the paint, and it just stabilizes it, because sometimes pigment doesn't always dust off. There are a whole series of like high humidity can cause it, incredible use can cause it, quick temperature changes, or it could have just been mixed poorly to begin with, or the quality of the glue could have been off. I mean, there are so many things. But do you know the how these are put together? No. So when they came from Kansas City, that have arrived by train car, and you would have basically, that have been rolled vertically like this, and then that have been unloaded, brought to the theater, all of the stage machinery would have been installed, and that have been laid down, and then take that top sandwich batten, it's like this one, but it's it's up there, and that's where the operating lines connect to. It basically, get this out of my hand, it's 2 pieces of fabric that sandwich, 2 pieces of wood that sandwich the fabric, and then take that back piece and then nail it with cleat nails to the stage floor so it wouldn't shift. You'd take the little furniture tacks and you'd tack along your painted scene, and then you'd put the second batten on the top, and you'd screw it in, and then you'd pry up the whole thing, knock over the cleats, and you have this perfect batten that goes, that drill through holes to accept the pick points, and you got what, 3? It looks like 3, yeah. Well, it's a tough call because there's something going on up there. But basically, and then you do the same thing to the bottom, and this is a perfect system because this weight keeps it perfectly taut. All of the fabric is evenly compressed together so that when it hangs, this is the right amount. What you never want to do is cut that off because it warps, put on a pipe pocket, because then you've created like a perforated page and it would just rip the whole thing down. Same with the top. By the 20s, you start having what we are more common with now, the jute webbing with the grommets and the tie lines and the pipes. You really can't do that to these because it's the same thing. This was painted to work with this system. And so that's in many ways what has preserved it. and there aren't wrinkles. And usually wrinkles aren't introduced unless those pick points for the operating lines get out of whack. But this is gorgeous, and can I take pictures of the scene up close? Of course. So what questions do you have as I'm like here?
Is there a signature?
It would be on the back in the center or in that corner.
These lights will only go so far. Oh, nothing like this though, if it wants to stay on. Thank you. I don't want to miss anybody's voice, so I'm looking for one condo.
Okay, so you see the vertical seams? That's the whole deal with when it was rolled vertically. That's one of the reasons why you have it. And this is just
Sorry, what
standard.
did you say?
So the vertical.
One time. Go ahead, thank you.
So the vertical seams are very standard with what was delivered. By the 1920s, this would shift to larger pieces of fabric that were horizontally run. But the vertical seams, like with a moving panorama, would help the transportation, and it was also cheaper to do. Sometimes you can find the textile mill stampings on them. I am not seeing anything. So if there's not a label that says Kansas City Scenic, there should be a size up in that corner, because as it made its way from like the sewing area to the paint shop, they'd have to have a way of identifying it. But I'm not, and it would be like way up there, Greg. I'm gonna sneak past you. Charcoal should come. I was gonna say, it would be way up in that corner, and I'm not seeing anything. Oh, wow. No.
Any rivets, Wendy?
So my most entertaining patch that I've come across is one of the drops that I've documented before it was patched with sheet metal and rivets.
Oh, goodness.
And that sounds like, wow. Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, what were you thinking? Metal on fabric.
Though there's no, here's a patch. Though there's no signature, do you have any opinion or suspicions who may have painted it?
Well, this looks, yeah, actually, I really think it's Kansas City Scenic. If you even look at the composition of what was delivered to the Tabor in 1902, it's similar. As far as a front curtain, tough call, because it doesn't present as a front curtain, it presents as an oleo drop with the composition.
But within the Kansas City company, do you know individual artists?
You can track them down.
Or was this like the Rembrandt studio? This was a whole, someone did the trees, someone did the water, someone did the architectural elements.
I'll be able to identify it at some point. Right now, the parent company of Kansas City Scenic, I'm starting to track those artists, because you can tell, it just takes time. And it takes looking at different examples as far as who was on the studio books at that time, because scenic artists, once they were in a studio, so from when the very, let's say, mid to late 19th century scenic artists, they traveled from theater to theater, and they would go to town, and basically they'd pick up sign painting jobs or whatever you possibly wanted to do to keep you afloat in painting. And Kansas City Scenic started that way too. It was 3 artists and a stage mechanic, Chudy, Dunn, and Oldham, and then the mechanic starts with an L that I can't remember. But they would go from town to town throughout Kansas and basically install the machinery, paint the scenery on site and everything. By the 1870s, 79, 80, there was a company in Chicago that was actually the parent company of Kansas City Scenic that decided to do almost like a mail order business, where they placed ads across the country in newspapers and said, hey, we'll send scenery to you, you just give us your dimensions. And so it started to shift from an itinerant artist that traveled across the country to an actual scenic studio that home-based out of a city, a central city like Kansas City or Chicago, because you had access throughout the country, more so than the studios in New York or San Francisco, is you could bid better than almost all of them because you had that spider web of transportation network. And as the studios built up, it wasn't the Renaissance man scenic artist anymore. They hired people for their skills. So there were the landscape painters and the drop curtain painters who actually could do a little of everything, and the figure painters and the exterior painters for like exterior architecture or interior architecture. And there was a grading system, but the idea was they paint toward their strengths so they're faster and they're more economical and therefore the profit is higher, versus someone who can do woods really well but really struggles with architecture. So they wouldn't have any time wasted, and the young scenic apprentices would be trained up in that system, and they would embrace a skill. And you could do all equally, which was the hallmark of a good artist, but they would really narrow in on what you do extremely well. So that's why you can figure out who it is. You just have to go on books and who was there and what their strengths were.
So are we seeing here, is this evidence of some moisture that got in here, or what's the difference between the clean streaking and the soiled, consistently soiled back face?
Well, these white streaks are where it's rubbed on something, and there is water damage visible throughout. The cracks.
From the crinkles and the cracks, particularly over here, that one's.
The crinkles suggest that this was lowered multiple times and messed with, whether it changed lines, but that's what this usually comes from. And when you get that crinkle where it's painted a little too thick, as the sediment kind of starts to go, you'll have all these loose surface contaminants. On the backside, it will pick up more, and you'll be able to start seeing the outline. This will all clean off, and it will look white again. I mean, but that has to happen. And there's often more grime on the back than on the front, because the backside will capture the dirt with the raw fabric, whereas the front sealed. So it's kind of like something that's porous that'll grab more dirt.
So walk us briefly through this process. We're about to embark on abatement of the pigeon droppings that you will see eventually are on almost every surface, and we see evidence of feathers and droppings on the back. Before we do that, what's the process of cleaning this professionally, removing it, taking it somewhere else before all of that activity takes place?
Oh yeah. So first of all, you have to have basically a rigging crew come in to stabilize it, because as Michael was pointing out, and hey Michael, where are you? Could you please explain why the ropes are compromised from the pigeon droppings? The acidity? This is really important.
Droppings from the birds, and it's been there obviously for a while. And the problem is it's very difficult to determine just how much damage has been done to the actual ropes over the years, how much is soaked into the inside or how much of it is just on the surface. And so it's going to have to be very careful. Anything up there that's got weight on it. I don't know if are the strip lights actually rigged to the rigging, or are they dead hung?
They are rigged to the rigging.
They would be one of the most dangerous things, simply because of the weight. Precautions would have to be taken when lowering them in order to make sure the rope didn't part at some point during the lowering process. And that's basically the issue. And the ropes obviously need to be replaced as soon as possible in the process. I'd love to see some pictures of the actual loft blocks up close and the actual head blocks up close. See what kind of condition those are in. Chris, when you were up there, did you are the loft blocks and head blocks, are they steel side or are they still wood side?
I'm not sure what pieces you're referring to, loft block.
Okay. We can talk about that later.
Cool.
after you have someone to come in and secure the top of it with new ropes, just in case those ropes would give and break while it's being lowered. The drop gets lowered, the bottom's pulled out, it's lowered down onto plastic because it can't just be lowered down onto the floor. So stage has plastic, you lower it. The top battens come off, the bottom battens come off. The whole thing receives low suction surface cleaning as long as none of the pigment is coming off. If pigment comes off, you can't do that. But the back for sure gets it, so you remove those contaminants prior to rolling it. Ideally, it's also receiving a little bit of a deep surface clean. That would be on the front so that you're not encapsulating the dirt. And you roll it this way, store the battens that have also been cleaned with it, and when it gets ready to be rehung, you just reassemble it. And the reassembling and the hanging is quite easy. It's the taking down. That's option 1. Option 2 is that, again, you bring it down on plastic, you roll it up, and you roll it this way with the battens on. However, that can damage the surface. Otherwise, you're rolling it on like a cardboard tube or some kind of tube that's been pressed. But those are the 2 processes to do it.
Okay,
And it can go into temporary storage. Yeah, shoot.
When I saw you doing that at the table.
I'm going to ask for quiet just because I'm
Oh,
hearing it through the headphones, and I know that I'm losing each voice. Thank you.
So, shoot. Yeah, go.
Well, what you just described is what I witnessed when I visited you at the Tabor.
Mm-hmm.
You had the plastic on the stage and you were in the process of doing exactly what you just described.
Yeah, and it brings into context what these are, because these are not scenery. It's not scenery like today's scenery. It's a different fabric, it's a different painting style, it's a different approach, and it's a different material. So contemporary stage scenery is as different from this as a fresco ceiling. So anyway, do you need to turn off your light?
Do I need to, is it better off?
Is it too bright for you?
Just a little bit.
Okay, got it.
Hey, if you would point it straight up, Stephanie, that would be the best thing. It'll
Okay,
sit on the
that's
floor
awesome.
and just look up at what we're talking about.
Yeah. So basically, when you think about this, these are large-scale artworks by nationally recognized artists, but they're not large-scale oil paintings, they're distemper paintings, and they're not large-scale pieces that are going to hang permanently on a wall. It's part of an interactive art installation that was created to go with a specific lighting system. It was created to have a specific frame. This just wasn't a stage house that was a box. It was a stage house that was intended to have a specific scenic illusion that was to be part of the audience experience when they came in, and that was to accompany many plays, but they're not just big paintings. And therefore, they kind of transcend there's a special way you have to handle them. You know, now we can fold up scenery and throw it in, and in many cases, painted scenery, because of the type of premixed paint that's used, if a little bit of water hits it, it's not crucial. With this, if a little bit of water hits it, it completely reactivates and will run or disappear. So in how you perceive this is a visual aesthetic that drew together all different demographics from the United States. This demographic, well, and actually Europe too, this scenic illusion, and it would probably be better if we were actually seeing the painting, but this illusion you could find at Al Ringling's Grand Circus Spectacles and Coney Island and the Columbian Exposition, and it was the same painted style. This surrounded everyone's daily life, regardless of what you did. And I mean, I can't think of a single visual aesthetic at this point in time that does that anymore. So it's not that these were just backings for shows. When these were delivered, the artist or the studio was celebrated. You'd know who was producing it or who was building the theater, and then who was actually delivering all of the scenery, because it was celebrated. And that starts to die off by World War I. So this comes in at that crucial, almost golden age of scenic art that's from, approximately 1880 to 1920. But the peak of production, there was so much going on everywhere that you could actually embrace what was going on. There was work for everyone, and people were surrounded by this beautiful painting. So,
Wendy,
little passionate about
we've had, thank you for that. We've had a discussion before where you talked about the continuity in that this type of a backdrop, it's serving as kind of a civic or cultural glue between communities across the country, much like television did. It kind of contributed to a shared experience. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
And actually, Michael and I were speaking of this, but can we get down the other side of the drop?
Well, before we do, Gregory, ask that question when the backdrop is behind us, but I have to draw everybody's attention to the paint rail, where it is said that 3, 4, or 5 backdrops exist and are rolled.
I am not surprised, and I can't tell you, of everything that's in the theater, the most thing that I'm excited about is actually the paint bridge, because that's your living history of artists who were on that, who painted scenery. Because, you know, once you installed something, it wasn't just, here are your 5 sets, that's it. That add pieces as touring shows would come in. Or, I mean, that is so remarkable, and people always want that to go away because it takes up space. But I would kill to be able to paint a backdrop up there and actually see what it was like, because I can't think of many scenic artists that have that experience or option at all anymore. They're usually removed. So I saw that and I just about screamed, but I didn't. So
Let me know if that happens, you need an assistant.
I was going to say, no kidding, Greg, because I mean, I would love to. I mean, we have pictures of women painting in 1890s, 1900 long dresses, which I can't fathom climbing up the ladder in long dress. But just to have that experience, because it's not like you have your motorized paint frame in front of you. It's that feeling of you're up in the flies. And they would be painting up there as productions would happen below. And there are stories of paint cans getting kicked over, or people doing crossovers and accidentally bumping into people, or, you know, let alone fights breaking out on the paint bridge and people falling to their deaths. I mean, this is such an integral part of what American theater and that craftsmanship was, and so many are gone. And so that's why I think it's super cool.
I'm looking for spills.
That's a very good point.
I wish to stumble from here. I'm looking for drops.
Like, where are they? And I'm like,
Now,
okay.
say there are rolled backdrops, rolled scenic backdrops
Yeah.
up there. How to remove?
Oh, you just carefully loop them and bring them down.
And just the way I would picture. Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say no.
Oh, yeah.
There's only so many ways. And if I'm saying something wrong, Michael, please contradict me and let me know. But it is so exciting to see that, almost more so than the scenery.
go up the ladder, we'll look the other way.
Wendy,
Well, that won't get me there.
no, over here. See those rungs? It's those rungs. And Taylor has used those rungs to get up there. And also to use the stair to get up to the grade.
I'm completely happy to climb up if I can.
He's in now.
But anyway, we'll finish
Do you want me to
doing
hold on to
this.
that flashlight? or do you
Yeah,
think
that'd
you
be
want
best.
this?
No,
You have this in your phone if you
yeah.
need
Hey,
to.
so I am not going to document,
Please don't.
but when we are in front of the backdrop, you'll tell us about what you know based on
That'd be
your
great.
experience.
Greg, I'm gonna go up. I just need
Taylor,
tennis
would
shoes.
you-
I
would you
need
be
tennis
willing to
shoes.
climb up again?
Okay.
I'm going to pause the camera quite a little bit. I count 18 different sets of ropes.
Yeah.
Am I right?
I can't tell, but I would, if you know how to count from 1 to 2, you can count to 18. Yes.
With 18 sets of ropes, each one is operating a curtain or a light bar out here.
Correct.
And your question about whether or not the light bars were rigged in a static way or able to be lowered, I
Correct.
believe they're able to be lowered. And that would be to be able to change the bulbs.
Oh, of course. I mean, you hope they're done that way. Otherwise, you got to get a ladder or scaffold or something to do it.
Right.
And there are way too many high schools and gymnatoriums and things around the country today. That's the only way you can change their golly gee whiz lights.
Right.
Scaffold or a telescope or something like that. And it's dangerous for the technician. it's just, there's easier ways to do it, and it's called rigging.
Sure, sure.
It's,
I know it was a big deal that this building was built as electrified in 1908.
absolutely.
Maybe one of the first, right?
There were buildings electrified back in the 1890s and forward. Clancy, J.R. Clancy, a rigging company out of Syracuse, New York, who still exists today, offered what they called a combined light at the time. It was a strip light. The strip light had about 10 or 15 gas jets and about 10 or 15 old incandescent electric light bulbs. So you had both of those two things at the same time on the same stage. And that was during the transition period from gas to electric. Settling gas for lighting purposes was first developed, I believe, around in the 1810s. I did a lot of research on it, but it's been a week or so since I've done that. And gas lighting first was developed in homes, and then, of course, into public buildings and theaters and things. And there were over 100 patents granted for the little porcelain devices that screwed into the pipes to make better flames, not flames that would burn more, but flames that would produce more light as opposed to smoke. The pipes above a stage that were used for stage lighting were not just a pipe with holes drilled in them, an open flame like your broiler in your gas stove. They actually had little porcelain tips. One of the most famous was called the batwing tip, and it produced a flame that had a scallop shape down and then up in the middle, batwing, and it produced the most light in comparison to the amount of gas burned. And it made a very flat flame. If you turned it on it sideways, it would look like an edge. That meant all the light was going forward and back, which is what you want. And that was the way the gas developed until electric light bulbs were invented and then became practical for people other than the inventors to use them. And they went into theater very quickly. Theater is quick to pick up any technology that they can get their hands on.
I like that. I like that. Something that strikes me when I look overhead, and I'm going to be able to put images of the things we're talking about while we're talking, right? There's so many different kinds of weights, including a big old bucket hanging above the stage. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, get rid of them as quick as possible. Those are makeshift weights, basically. Weights for, this is called a hemp system. Hemp refers to the fact that there are no steel counterweights riding in manufactured carriages on either guide slots in the wall or guide wires attached to the floor and the grid up above. That's called a counterweight system. This was what's called a hemp house, and it strictly is rope up, rope over a pulley, rope down, something to fly. Most of the theater scenery had between 3 and 5 ropes on it, so the ropes were spread out to even the weight out. And on the other end, you used a sandbag as a counterweight. The sandbags were manufactured for the purpose, and there were several different methods of what they call clew, C-L-E-W, clewing the sandbag to the ropes so that it would not slip. There's what's called a Sunday, which is just literally a wire rope loop about this big, and you push it through itself around the rope, hang the sandbag onto the loop, and it tightens about the rope so tight it won't slip. That's one way. Another way is with the what they call a clamp, trim clamp, and it's got this cast iron body about this big and has between 3 and 5 spring-loaded pawls inside. You run the ropes through them, and you can push it up, but you can't pull it down without opening it up. Okay. And that makes it very easy to quickly trim the ropes, because ropes, unlike steel wire, do not stay the same length from day to day. Humidity, heat affect those ropes, and if you had a drop today this way, it gets real humid, tomorrow it's that way, because the longest line might be 40 feet longer than the shortest line. And so the amount of stretch or swelling from the drying out or the liquid in the moisture in the air is going to affect this rope more because there's more rope to affect. It's that simple. So you had to adjust the ropes every day if you had a show every day.
Wow.
It may not be much, but it may only be an inch or two.
But it still needed that
Still
attention.
needed that every day.
Wow.
And some of the scenery that would be flown in theaters like this was very light, like the drop that's on stage at this present time. Some of it would be rather heavy, like a fully framed box set or a ceiling piece that's set down on a box set. Fully framed canvas, and some of those weigh 200 or 300 pounds. Well, obviously, you can't just pull a rope that weighs more with a weight that's heavier than you. That's where you needed the sandbags, and you also wanted the sandbags just to make it reasonably balanced. The catch is, it can never be balanced. Otherwise, what's on stage won't go down. It has to be heavier than whatever weight you're using, no matter what. That's how you get it to come down. And then your muscles are what overcome that slight imbalance to raise it back up again. And then you tie it off. As far as the weights that are up there, I haven't seen all of them, but if they are a canvas bag with sand in it, with a rope that goes completely around it, so that the rope is actually lifting the weight rather than the sides just keep the sand in, and then a big steel snap hook, that's what snaps into either the clew, the sundae, or whatever you have to keep the rope in one place. And that's where you hook the sandbag on in order to balance the set.
Does this hemp house remind you of, well, what other theaters does it remind you of?
Oh, thousands.
Sure.
At the turn of the century, almost all legitimate theaters were what we would call a hemp house because counterweight was in its infancy. The first counterweights were simply a steel rod with a slotted circle that sat on top of it and put 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And they just hung free over in the wings to balance the scenery. One of the first to develop a guided system was J.R. Clancy. Some of the Scottish Rite riggers also developed a counterweight system. It's our belief that some of the European systems were fully developed long before they got over here. They were ahead of us on that particular thing. And that is the counterweight arbor that is 2 steel rods, about 2 feet apart, roughly, actually 15 inches for most of them, with a cast iron plate then, top and bottom. Today it's forged steel rather than cast iron. We discovered cast iron can get brittle. But the weights then are designed to have a groove in one end that sits over the bar at each end. So you have to tip it, let it fall down, and it can't fall out unless something very shock happens, like it bounces on the floor or something. Gotcha. And you put 20-pound weights, 40-pound weights until you weight scenery, and you can get some pretty heavy loads that way, like orchestra shells, things of that sort, and which is the way we do it now.
What's this?
This is a stage plug. These plates, you can see where the wire's hooked up there.
Yeah.
These went to a light. This went into the wall. As a matter of fact, if you got your lights, I can show you 2 places, a couple other examples of it. Here's a stage light. Very modern for the time. It's got it'd be nice if you could get this knife switch that's down here, and a couple of fuses there. Wire, wire, wire. There's your plug.
Wow.
That's how it's done. Now, the way you plugged it in, right over here, happens to be, I won't be able to see it too good. Basically, it's a big porcelain opening, and it should not be hot, but you can plug it in.
It should not be hot.
Right, and I'm not going to plug it in, because right now, I don't know. And you'd be amazed how sometimes these things are or aren't still hot. You just push it in. You notice even when it's plugged in, these pieces still be exposed. Wow. So electric lighting, it was in its infancy. There's a little bit of danger involved there.
Yeah, no kidding.
But, yeah.
Can you make sense of any of the chalk writing on the wall over here?
Well, where? Behind me or over there?
Next to you. These set of ropes.
Oh, this one just says down, meaning
Oh, good.
if you pull this rope, the curtain should go down. This one says up, that means if you pull this rope, the curtain should go up. I could be wrong about which one is which, but that's what the sign said. This one, I don't know. This could probably be the fire curtain, clipped off so it's have to be cut in order to release. Looks like, no, I can't even tell what that is.
Yeah, we believe that is the fire curtain, and the one behind it is connected to a few hundred pounds of weight over your head. Check that out.
This one here?
No, the next one over.
This one.
Yep.
Yeah, the few hundred pounds of weights because fire curtains are very heavy.
Yep.
And some of them have steel framing and everything. And if yours is still asbestos, it'll either need to be encapsulated or destroyed, unfortunately.
Can you describe these counterweights up here?
I can't see them.
If you look up.
Yeah, those, remember when I told you that
Yep.
back in the 1890s, the J.R. Clancy had some circular weights with a slot that just went over a steel rod? Those are them. Those are that style. I don't know if that's a Clancy product or not. And then this motorized device down here in the front is a front draw curtain, I believe.
It is, and that's from the 1929 renovation.
Correct.
Is our light panel in a common location?
I don't know.
It's up over your head.
Oh, for this era, yes. What type is it? Is it rheostat?
No, it's open copper throw switches.
Okay, that makes it a switchboard rather than a dimmer. On the very bottom row, point your light up there on the very bottom row. See those circular things?
Yep.
Those are actually dimmers. Those are Ditron plate resistance dimmers. When your light is bright, it's bypassing the dimmer. When your light is dim, the dimmer is basically a resistor in line with the rest of the circuit. And it dims the light by creating heat. So if you're the board operator, it gets very warm in when you have a night scene.
But this corner of the stage would have been a common place to put the light control panel.
Yes, sometimes on the floor. Sometimes if there was more building off to the side, there would be a small door right there leading directly to it and be just off stage, making more room for the actors. Sometimes it'd be right where you're standing, in the way of everybody, but still there.
Nice.
So,
thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? I'll be happy to answer.
Not off the. Okay, so curtain by curtain. We've got the 1929 velvet curtain with the gold trim.
Right.
Then we've got a wooden bar.
Right.
Which I can't rule out being an early projection screen. Right. In fact, Gregory's going to point to each one as I go. And then there's a light bar.
Yep.
And then there's a velvet curtain that's far above the light bar, and boy, it looks like it's a quarter of the size. Why is it so short?
It's probably what we call a teaser.
Okay.
It's only meant to go across the top and just basically hide the next row of lights and the bottom of the next row of scenery.
Gotcha.
And that's called a teaser, sometimes called a border curtain.
And then the next row is another long black teaser.
Yep, that's exactly what it would be.
And then, boy, there's, 3 wooden bars in a row. I want you to be able to see what you're talking about here.
Yeah. Those, I would have to examine them up close to see what they really are. Those look like curtain tracks. Traveler tracks.
Okay.
For draw curtains. And the early ones were made of wood.
Oh.
And basically they had 2 long pieces of wood. You would take a router or similar and make a long semicircular slot in it, and then you would saw up to it from one side. So when you put 2 of them together, you had a hole through a very long board with a slot running out the bottom. You would take a wooden ball, slightly smaller than that hole, but too big to fall through the slot. You'd put a wire through the ball, have a hook on the bottom of the wire. The ball would ride through that wooden slot. The hook would attach to your draw curtain. And then you'd have pulleys and ropes just to pull the curtain open and shut, just like you do today. And at some point they figured out that you can do that with steel. When they developed steel rolling mills, so that you could roll that shape that today's curtain tracks are. And it's exactly the same principle, just slightly older technology.
There's 2 wooden bars and then a very long wooden bar that has a very short black curtain on either side of it. It's right before the second light bar.
Right. The bar that the curtains are hanging from is simply called a batten. It's a device at the end of the ropes to hang things on. The things they're hanging on that one are the 2 side curtains. The side curtains are called legs or tormentors. They call them all the way to the ground, and basically they provide a place for actors and scenery to come off stage and be out of sight of the audience without having to go clear into the basement or something further off stage.
Sure.
Normally legs would be set right about where I am standing now in a series maybe 5 or 6 feet apart, and they would be and they would be on either side. Some of the scenery that we get from the Scottish Rite temples are what are called cut drops. They're a forest scene, except there's no middle. It's what we would call a leg, like you see up there, but they would have a border on the same piece, all in one big piece. Be trees going up to leaves going across. You have 2 or 3 of those with a big forest scene in the back, and it can look very realistic just being painted. And that's one way they would do it.
Nice. There's a light bar, then there's a gold curtain, and then there's one that has had me mystified, and I'd love everybody's opinion on it. It's got some stenciling. It's kind of an Egyptian theme, and looks like it's folded over on itself. Gregory's got his light on it now.
Yeah.
I was looking at that.
What could that be?
Ask Wendy.
Actually, more of a backing piece
Okay.
that
I'm
because
gonna get you from this other direction.
Oh, no,
'cause-
no. It's just folded for storage. I think it probably goes across the entire stage.
Yeah, that's my
And
guess.
it would, boy, that could have been the front curtain at one point when they renovated.
Yep.
Because you'd have transitioned from a painted front curtain to fabric, and a lot by even by 1920, probably the teens into the 20s, they started using more painted ornament. It's almost, it loses the pictorial artistry and it becomes more of a stencil.
And then from there on, that's the last painted thing that I've ever seen. Would you, knowing that the theater was converted to film in 1929, we can rest assured that all of these curtains are pre-1929, yes? Maybe?
Not necessarily. So
Okay.
with film, when you first had those early screens, the projection was in a painted surround. So you'd have like a garden with various layers and leg drops and side drops. And in the center, that's where the projection would go. But it was painted. And slowly, fabric draperies, instead of the painted curtains, were replaced, where you start just having the screen and more curtains come in. Now, if you look through design books, it depends on what region of the country you were in as far as what year that shifted over or who was in charge and the artistic intent. But there were still painted curtains being delivered in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, it wasn't that, it just wasn't. And this was also a combination house, which meant it was film and live theater. So you're trying to cater to both, both types of entertainment.
Oh, I'm trying to find evidence of live performance after 1929, and have yet to.
Really?
Yeah.
Have you done the Colorado well, I'm sure you have. Colorado Historic Newspaper. What about newspaperarchives.com?
What I'm doing is the Chronicle News is all on microfiche.
Right.
I'm going day by day. And I did kind of a scatter shot, 1929 to the early 30s, and nothing, just film after film.
Well, but sometimes it's not always in the hometown newspaper. There's a mention from another city where they're appearing. It would be like this troupe who just performed at, and they might not have even been covered. And so that's one of the articles that I came across today. So just because it's not in the hometown newspaper, it's like the Leadville Daily Herald. Not all the stuff that was happening in town always made the newspaper, and I don't understand why, because that actually almost makes no sense, but you'll find acts that are referenced, and I know that newspapers make mistakes, and I understand that things are just incorrect, but it's the cross-referencing between the two. So I would be surprised if whether it was a high school graduation or a wedding or a dance or a boxing match or something, there was not some kind of entertainment beyond screen.
Well, remember, in the basement, we've got a ballroom.
Right.
With a dance band and that space down there. And I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, I would love to know.
I gotta keep digging.
Well, yeah, that's what I started doing this morning at like 4. I'm digging, going like, gee, I wonder if I can find any more. I haven't tried this search result yet. So it's just, so you were talking. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's all good. It's all good.
Two more curtains. There's this one, and then we missed one in the very front. Let's continue going back.
Yeah,
Okay,
going
so-
backward, there's the one with the lining there. Your light is just about on it. It looks kind of silver gold there on the edge.
Like stars,
Yep.
because I'm pretty sure those are suspended something. I don't think those are feathers, do you?
Yes.
Oh, that's too bad. So I was hoping it was stars.
This gold curtain here in front of the light bar has a number of feathers on it that
Okay.
I'm expecting that many on all the curtains, right?
Yeah.
Would either of you be able to talk about the painting backstage? The 3 feet of gray and the markings on the floor, because they're actually really cool.
Oh, you mean where
Yeah.
to walk and where not to walk?
Is that original to 1908?
I don't know actually. Stage floors were painted so much. This could be the sheer result of one actor that cannot stay out of the sight lines, and they needed this will help Bobby not cross the line so people can see him while the scene's going on. I mean, it could be something. Michael, any ideas?
That, or for a dark entrance, face a very, you notice
So you
it's
don't kill yourself.
painted white or something. These lines show you where you can get to when it's very dark backstage, behind the curtains. Gives you something to look at so you can kind of guide yourself. Today, stages use LED lights, a little about the size of a pinhead that the actors can see and the audience can't. Makes it a lot easier.